Good afternoon, dear students. This is Gilles Tellier. I'm your new lecture professor for this semester. I take over from Mr. Calvini-Lefebvre for 3 lectures on the 19th century. Today in our program we have the date 1859 and the title Angel and Apes. You will see we were going to deal with science and religion in Victorian times. Next week I shall be dealing with 1872 and the Crystal Palace speech by Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, and it will be an opportunity for us to talk about politics. And my final lecture, before I hand over the micro to my colleagues, my wonderful colleagues from the 20th century, will be devoted to the date 1885 and entitled Death in Khartoum. As you all know, Khartoum is in Sudan. Therefore, we will be dealing with the British Empire. So for today, you all have the PowerPoint in front of you, I'm sure. I hope so. It will be easier for you to follow. The first slide is about the title of our lecture, so I don't need to comment on that. So please go to slide number 2, which is our title, 1859, Angels and Apes. And the perspectives is about the history of ideas. We will see that in a few seconds. Slide number 3, you have a nice picture of an angel and a caricature of well-known scientist Charles Darwin. Now, the date is mentioned as being the publication of The Origin of Species by Charles Darwin. You all heard about this famous book and the revolution it brought about, not only in Great Britain, but also in the rest of the world. You will see that under the title Angel and Apes, you have 3 subtitles. All of them are, of course, part of our program today. The British Isles Christian nations. May I put the emphasis on the plural. Number 2, when religion clashed with sciences. And finally, 3, science and social progress. So, without further ado, let's go on to the introduction. I will let you read it. I'm not going to read it now. You know how to read, so there's no need for me to help you on that matter. But just to sum it up, the idea that the 19th century is really a great revolution. This revolution was brought about by the Industrial Revolution, which brought new technology, new developments, and linked to new developments, new sciences, which were there to help those new developments, such as, for example, when people wanted to find coal in order to produce steam and therefore to work the plants, they had to find the coal, and therefore they had to rely on geologists, people who were specialized in the finding of minerals. And coal was, of course, one of the most precious one at the time. So we will see that this, of course, clashed with former attitudes and values and beliefs, such as that of the Christian religion. And to be more precise, we'll come back on that on the Protestant aspect, part of the Christian faith. But we'll come back on that. This is just the introduction to give you the broad perspective of our lecture. So I invite you to go to slide number 5, and we were going to deal with the first subpart, the British Isles Christian nations, and it is subdivided, as you can see, in 2 subparts. The background you must know. You know, this is what you always do, that is reminding you of the context, and sometimes, of course, maybe not reminding you, but teaching you, because it's going to do with the past before the 19th century, that is at least the 18th century, but maybe the 17th century, or maybe earlier. And of course, this is the program you will have next year, so you might not know about it yet. Anyway, you must know it, so we're going to talk about it. And the second subpart will be Victorian and the Christian faith. Of course, we'll try to define some of the words here, which are not always clear for people. Slide number 6, the background you must know, Catholicism versus Protestantism, the Henrician Reformation, 16th century. So first, the population of the British Isles, I'd like to remind you that there is an ethnic difference within the population. And it's, of course, we have to delve into history in order to find out the differences. If you look at the maps that you see on slide number 7, you will see that there was a migration. You know, roughly speaking, that the population in the British Isles at the origin is Celt, the Celtic races. And this is, of course, something that is not just particular to the British Isles, because the Celts were everywhere in Europe, all the way to Eastern Europe. France, which at the time was divided into many tribes, all Celts. Vercingétorix, for example, was a Celt king, and people from Brittany boast their origin from a Celtic origin. This is why you have the Celtic festival at Lorient, where they play bagpipe and sometimes wear kilts, just like their cousins from Scotland, Wales and Ireland. But we'll come back on that. So as you can see, there was an invasion around 400 and 500 AD, Anno Domini, which means after Jesus Christ. And you see that these population came from what is now northern Germany, Denmark, and the Netherlands. These populations were Saxons, mainly Saxons, but also their cousins, the Angles, hence the name Anglo-Saxon that you all know of. And of course, you understand that it gave its name to the country they invaded. The land of the Angles is now called England, in French, la terre des Angles, l'Angleterre. The Juts, as you can see, were from Denmark, so there were Saxons, and with a particular specificity, which is that of Scandinavians. The Juts are already Scandinavians, just like the Norwegian and the Swedes, which means that they were Vikings. Vikings, you can say also. And so this is a key element of the understanding of British history. As you know, England is therefore has a Germanic origin. Even the language, as you can see, as you know, if you have learned German, you know that the language is close to, the German language is close to English because of its origin. If you work on a text like Beowulf, the famous hero, well, it's in Old English, but you need to know German in order to be able to read it. So what happened, of course, as you can see on the map in the middle, that the Celts couldn't resist the arrival of the Angles and the Saxons and the Frisians and the Juts, and they had to go to what we might say or call the margin of the British Isles, that is Scotland in the north, Ireland in the west, and Wales in the south west. And this is why today there is an expression which is that there is a Celtic fringe, F-R-I-N-G-E, to the British Isles. And you may not have noticed, but when I was younger, whenever the English rugby team would go to play in Scotland, in Murrayfield, the God Save the Queen would be booed by Scottish people, just to show you that they were not in friendly terms. And of course, closer to you, you know there was a referendum to know whether Scotland would leave the United Kingdom or not. It failed, so Scotland is still part of the United Kingdom, but we know that with the Brexit, things might change again. All of this can be explained and traced back to that period when, therefore, Celts and Germanic populations faced each other. You can see also that as far as Christian denominations are concerned, England was evangelized by missionaries. You probably know the one from Ireland, St. Patrick, because you know that St. Patrick is a national day in Ireland, and of course you might have been to a pub to share a beer with Irish people. The others are less known, but just to show you, of course, that it is the time when missionaries brought Christianity to those populations. Let's go on now to slide number 8, and this chart gives you a rough sketch of the origin of the populations that now people the British Isles, and you have also their faith, and which might, well, of course, is going to be very important and very interesting for you, including for the history of the United States of America. This is not our program, but you know, of course, that it is closely linked. So if you look at Cornish people, if you look at the first column, Cornish, of course, is the people from Cornwall. If you don't know where it is, please take a map and go on the internet and try to find it. Welsh, of course, is people who live in Wales. Irish, I made a distinction from the south. Scottish people from the north. Scottish from the south. Scottish from the north are called the Highlanders. And Scottish from the south are called Lowlanders. This is the geographic denomination. English, of course, we have just talked about them. And Irish from the northern part of Ireland, which is now called Ulster. The origin is interesting. As you can see, there is a difference. The Cornish, Welsh, Irish, and Scottish are all from Celt origin, or close to Celts, the Gaels, the Picts. You know, the Picts are important in history because they were painted, they painted their faces blue when they went to war against the Romans. And this is why the Romans used the word, well, invented the concept of pigmentation, and Picts gave picture and pictural in French through Latin. So Picts is interesting because, as you can see, there is a consequence on linguistics. Then the Scottish from the south, the Lowlanders, in fact, were Anglo-Saxons that migrated to the south of what is now Scotland. And they were from Roman origin, Angles and Saxons, we just mentioned that, so from Germanic origin, Danes from Denmark, that is Vikings, and Normans. As you can see, Normans are close to the Danes because they are Vikings also, but they are Vikings that became French. They were given, a Viking chief called Rollo was given land which took the name of the population, the land of the Northmen. And in French it's la Normandie, la terre des hommes du Nord. So the Normans were French Vikings who invaded Britain and started a French dynasty there. English, of course, once again you have a mix of all these people, and Irish in the north also, because they were migrants to Ireland and they started to dwell there, and they're still there. Their descendants still there, live there. The geography, I'm not going to go into details because I've just mentioned that. What is interesting also is religion. As you can see, that most of the Celt people are Catholics, while Saxons are more Protestants. And this is one of the reasons why there were war in Ireland between Protestants and Catholics, and you heard about that. You may think about a song called Bloody Sunday, which might give you an insight into that story. But of course, this is not our program, so we'll skip that. But please look at that, remember that chart, which is quite important. Where does Protestantism come from? Well, maybe you know a little bit of that history. You have here all those monarchs in front of you, in slide number 9, are all from the same family. They are called Tudors. Tudors, T-U-D-O-R. You may have seen a series on television about the Tudors, because of course it's quite a graphic story, even sometimes gory, because the first man you see with a beard, Henry VIII, had 2 of his wives decapitated, and of course it was quite, well, if it was a bit common at the time, it is something that history keeps in mind. So Henry VIII, in fact, was the first one to create the Protestant Church in England, which, taking its Latin origin, Ecclesia Anglicana, which means Church of England, at the origin used to be a Catholic and depended on the Pope. But because for several reasons, political reasons, I'm not going to talk about now because it's not my purpose, and you'll study that next year, he changed this Ecclesia Anglicana into a Protestant church, not obeying anymore to the Pope. As a consequence, the church became known as the Anglican Church, and therefore you should all remember, still today, it is a Protestant church. Officially, the head of the church is the monarch, so today it's Queen Elizabeth II, and officially the monarch is not allowed to get married to a Catholic person, because Catholics must not come back to the throne of England. This is part of British history. You'll come back on that. Henry VIII had 6 wives because his problem was that he wanted a son. So he got divorced from his first wife, with whom he had a daughter called Mary Tudor. She is the first lady on the left, so you have Henry VIII on the left, sorry. Then you have Edward VI, his son. Then you have Mary Tudor, his eldest daughter, and another daughter called Elizabeth, and she will become known as Queen Elizabeth I. This, for his succession, his son Edward VI became King of England as a Protestant leader, to be more precise, as a Calvinist. We're going to see the differences in a second. As a Calvinist leader, Protestant. But as he died young, it was his eldest sister who was the daughter of the first wife of Henry VIII, and she was a Catholic. And she started persecuting the Protestants, wanting to change back the country and the Ecclesia Anglicana into a Catholic church. So she killed a lot of Protestants, and this is why she earned the nickname of Bloody Mary. And you probably know the name because it's also a drink based on tomato, reminding of the blood of the English Protestants. As she died without a son, it was the other sister, Queen Elizabeth I, who became Queen of England, and she went back to Protestantism, but this time she said she would come back to the origin, that is Protestantism, which is not Calvinist, but Lutheran. So how do you know the differences in the different Protestant denominations? Well, you have a few of the Protestants' names that are at the origin of Protestantism. You know, the first one was a German monk called Martin Luther. Of course, he is also famous today because he gave his name to a famous pastor, so Protestant priest, a pastor, black American pastor Martin Luther King. Of course, Martin Luther King was named after the founder of the Protestant Church, which is now called the Lutheran Church. He was a monk. He created the Lutheran Church, which is particularly based in Scandinavia and in Germany. France had another theologian that became Protestant too and wanted to go further away from Catholicism. He was a lawyer, and he created what is now called the Reformed Church. Most Protestants in France are from that Reformed Church, France or the Netherlands, for example. In England, the theologian was called Thomas Cranmer. He did not invent a church, but he was the first leader of this Anglican Church, which is a third Protestant denomination. which is a bit strange for the first two Protestant churches, because in order to not to hurt her subjects, Queen Elizabeth I decided to keep the hierarchy in the church, which means that there is a Catholic hierarchy inside a Protestant church, and it's called the Anglican Church. So this is why today most of the historical churches are either Lutheran, Reformed, or Anglican. Of course, you have a lot of evangelical churches, but they came later. Okay, the evangelicals that you see sometimes in the United States or in Brazil are descendants of those original churches. So this is the background that you need to know. Of course, you can carry on working on that by yourself. Slide number 10 is the structure of the Church of England. It is a Protestant church because, as I said, there is no pope. The leader of that church is the monarch. As I said, Henry VIII was the first one. The last one is Queen Elizabeth II. The difference also with the Catholic Church is that priests can get married. They can have a family without any problems, and the son can become a priest, or even the daughter. Now it is allowed for women to be priest in the Anglican Church. And another element which is typically Protestant, there is a direct relation between the believer and God. You know, in a Catholic Church, generally you have to confess to a priest. You cannot talk to God directly except when you pray. But for a Protestant, there's no confession with the pastor or the priest. You have the hierarchy, so this is just for your reminding of you a few things, that the first clergyman at the top of the church is the Archbishop of Canterbury, and above him, the ruler, the monarch, is at the head of the church. So this was things you had to know, you have to know, you must know, so please work on that and don't say, because France is a lay society, this is not interesting. You will not be able to understand and study British and American history and Commonwealth history if you do not have that in mind. We saw Mr. Trump with a Bible a few months ago, so in order to understand why he did something with a Bible in his hand, we must be aware of the history and the religious history. So I shall carry on now with my slide number 11, which is entitled 1b, Victorians and the Christian Faith. And you can see a real photograph from the Victorian era with people in church, and a painting also with a lady and children at church in order to illustrate this topic. I'll then go on directly to slide number 12 to as a reminder of the different branches. And maybe I should have put it before. Maybe that's a mistake. It's not a problem anyway. But you have at the bottom the Roman Catholicism, Western rites, because you know there are Eastern rites, that is Orthodox Catholics, Orthodox churches. That's the pink line at the bottom of this chart. Then you have a green line going up, and the first branch of that tree, I would say, as you can see, called 95 Theses, 1517, which is really the date of the beginning of Protestantism. And you have this branch in a dark green, and it's called Lutheran. So you remember, it's because of that monk, German monk called Martin Luther. Then later came what is called Reformed, Calvinist, and Presbyterian. So for those who know, Presbyterian are generally originate from Scotland. Presbyterians are Scottish Protestants, and as you can see, they are exactly the same as Reformed, Calvinist, and Presbyterian. They're from the same branch. Then you have sub-branch such as Anabaptists, Methodist, Baptist, and Adventist. Baptist, you may know what it is because I mentioned probably one of the most famous Baptist pastor, who was Martin Luther King. Martin Luther King was from the Baptist Church. So as you can see, he was a Calvinist. Then we continue on the trunk of the tree in green, and we arrive to Anglicanisms. We have just talked about it, Church of England. And you have another branch which is called Episcopalians. Of course, it is the same, but it means that it is Anglican people who are not from England, such as, for example, the Anglicans in America, in the United States, or in the rest of the world, in Australia, in Canada, in South Africa. They're called Episcopalians. It means that they have a bishop. You remember, I told you that the first Protestants, Lutherans, and Reformed, Calvinist, Presbyterians do not have bishops. They just have priests, that's all, pastors. Queen Elizabeth I kept the hierarchy, the structure, and therefore they kept bishops. And you remember, there is even an archbishop who is at the head of the church under the monarch. So this is why Episcopalians is the other name for Anglicans, but when they are not from England. And the last branch, which is a 20th century branch, which is the evangelical people. You see the Pentecostalism, for example, American churches, Great Awakenings. This is evangelical people. So you have a summary here of the Protestant churches, and of course you would be well advised to try to remember it. It's always interesting, for example, to know what is the church of a President of the United States. I'd like to carry on to my slide number 13. Just to remember that Britain has always been a religious country, of course, in terms of Christianity, since they were evangelized. St. Patrick in Ireland, you remember, as he is still revered as the Saint Patron of Ireland. Society was structured by religion, and there was no separation from state and church, which is an important element, because we know that in France it is the case. There is separation of state and church since 1905. And the Industrial Revolution and the social turmoil that followed left most churches unaware of the profound changes of the society was undergoing. Of course, the Industrial Revolution brought new dynamics in the society, and one of them was to reduce the importance of religion. Of course, you may be well aware of that, and we'll come back on that. You have the different denominations, and of course I included other religion than the Christian religion. Okay. By the way, I'd like to pinpoint one important thing. Christianism is a religion. Inside Christianism, you have churches. They are Catholics and Protestant, but you don't. Well, you can say the Protestant religion or the Catholic religion, but the official name of the religion is Christianity. Because whether Catholic or Protestant or Orthodox, people all believe in Jesus Christ. Judaism and Islam is different, of course. There are other religions, but they have something in common with Christianity, is that they are all monotheist religions. That is, they all believe in one God. By opposition, to the Greeks and the Romans, who, for example, or the Scandinavians, the Vikings, who had so many gods and goddesses. So here again, this chart is a reminder for you of the differences that you have in Britain at that time. Just to give you an example, the first mosque was opened in Liverpool in the 1860s. I can't remember the date exactly, but Islam was present there in the 19th century. Of course, Judaism had been present for many longer years. Slide number 14, you will read it in detail, but just to sum it up, there was a problem in the Church of England with priest absenteeism, which is found if you are Jane Austen enthusiast, whether the films or the book. particularly think about Pride and Prejudice, where you can see that Wickham is given a parish, but he doesn't want to become a priest. So it was a job at the time and not a vocation, which is a bit surprising today, of course, but at the time it meant that some people got the money but never went to work there. Of course, it was not fair, and this is why a lot of the government who paid for the priests had to intervene. I'll let you read all the details, and if you have any questions, of course, please ask me. This is more anecdotal than anything else. What is more important is in slide 15, 1851, the religious census. Now, a key element to the understanding of Britain in the Victorian era is that the Industrial Revolution brought a lot of changes, amongst which were a job migration. Why? Because, of course, until that period, the system was called the feudal system. You probably heard about it. In French, it's called le système féodal. And this feudal system used to be everywhere in the world. In Japan, in China, in South America, everywhere. The feudal system was the same. That is, as you know, in France or in England in the Middle Ages, a lord has knights, he has a castle, and he owns the land. On the land live a lot of people, generally peasants, who are who have to pay for the rent of the land they are working on. And of course, this is how the lord gets his money from. That is, he rents his land to peasants who have to give him some of their production, some of their harvest. As a compensation, of course, if there are enemies coming into the territory, the lord is going to protect the peasants with his knights, with his army. And so the peasants would gather in the castle, and the castle would be defended by the lord and the soldiers until the enemy is gone. This is called the feudal system. This system started to change for one simple reason, is that people stopped working the land. People stopped working, being peasants. Why? Well, because there were less and less jobs in agriculture. We will see that the economy was changing. Perhaps you saw on television today, in France, in England, farmers have difficulties having enough money to live. And so this started really after the Industrial Revolution. As a consequence, a lot of people left the countryside to go where the jobs were. And the jobs at the time were in the industry, the new emerging industries, particularly in the north of England, in the textile industry, for example, factories making machines, the shipbuilding yards, etc., etc. And so people moved in order to find those jobs, who were generally close to big cities. They were not in the countryside, they were urban jobs. Job in cities, because that's where the industries were. Why were the industries next to the cities or inside the cities? Well, for a simple reason, it's transport. If you produce goods, such as textile, you need to export your goods. If you export them, you need a way of transporting your goods. And this is why, because the railways were first set from one big city to the other, that industries started being in urban areas. What is more, another element of appreciation is that the northern part of England became industrial. Why? Well, for another simple reason, which is that that's where the coal mines are. And why is it important to have coal mines? Well, because coal is what is at the heart of the industry. That is, coal, and still today, we know that a lot of countries still produce coal, China, for example, but also Germany, instead of using petrol or more natural, well, more ecological, I would say, sources of production. So coal was necessary, and therefore it was better to have the industry in the north so that coal would not be too expensive being transported to the factory. So what happened is that there was a great shift from first from rural England to urban England, and second from working in a farm and working in the industry. Of course, the two are, go together. People finding a job in the industry had to live in town, or of course in the suburbs and sometimes the slums of the big cities. But this shift, of course, was not foreseen. There were no sociologists studying the peasantry at the time. And so the shift from rural England to urban England, which is the same as the shift from agricultural England to industrial England, this shift took place in the 1850s. That is, now in 1850, around the 1850s, there is a majority of the population that lives in cities and not in the countryside anymore. Once again, I repeat, the majority of the population now lives in cities and not in the countryside. And the shift is also from the majority of the population now works in the industry and not in agriculture. So it means a lot of people moved, and it had consequence on the religious aspect, because those people, as they moved, they went to, well, they didn't go to church anymore. They were not, they didn't go to Sunday schools when they were kids, so they didn't have any religious education. They were not forced, or they were not compelled to go to church. And sometimes, because of the shift, you can see that the church was not in walking distances from where they lived, because nothing had been anticipated. And what happened in 1851, there was a census that took place, and that enabled the government and religious authorities to discover that many people did not attend church. And this was a great shock for a Christian nation, because people were feeling that something was changing, something was becoming really different. And this is why they decided to make, churches decided to have a religious revival. So for that, I advise you to go to slide number 16. This revival, in a way, was like evangelizing inside the country. You know that we talked about early missionaries such as Saint Patrick, who came to evangelize Ireland. And you know of the missionaries who went to the colonies in the 19th century, such as in Africa, in Asia, etc. Well, there was another type of missionary first that went to evangelize the poor people in the poor suburbs of big English cities, particularly in the north. This was called the religious revival. Catholics did the same, as well as Protestant churches. Inside those Protestant churches, of course, the official one was the Anglican Church, the official church, which is still official today. And you had also the Calvinist churches that were present. These Calvinist churches, I forgot to tell you, but I can tell you now, they had to make a decision when Queen Elizabeth I became Queen of England, because you remember that she came back after her sister put back Catholicism in England. She went back to her father's Anglicanism. And she said, no, it's better to keep it that way. We don't want to be, to have the Pope as a lord. We want to be independent. That's funny, because it rings a bell about Brexit. But this is my comment. But Queen Elizabeth said, I don't want any extremes. I don't want any radical people. So I want the church to be Anglican. And so on either side, radicalism for her was the Catholics, or the Calvinist Protestant. And she said, either you join the Anglican Church, or if you stay, I don't want to have any problems with you. If you can't do that, you have to go away. And so a lot of Catholics left England to live on the continent in other Catholic countries, such as in France. Okay, for example, you had the nuns, English nuns, who lived in Belgium and France. They didn't want to stay in England because they couldn't. They were Catholic nuns. On the other hand, you had the Calvinists, who became known as non-conformists because they didn't conform to the Church of England, who stayed in England, but who were not allowed to have great political positions because they were not Anglican. And of course, in order to protect society, every civil servant had to be Anglican. So they decided to keep their faith, to stay Calvinist, but they renounced any political or social life. Those Calvinists who didn't want to stay, well, you know them very well, because they took a boat called the Mayflower and they went to the United States of America. And they created the original white group of which created America, the United States, sorry, which are the WASP, the White Anglo-Saxon Protestants. They were Calvinists who didn't want to stay in England and didn't join the Anglican Church. And you know that the WASP spirit is still present today, as analysts have said that the WASP have elected Mr. Trump. I'm not going to make any comments on that. Right, so the religious revival is something that happened at that time and became a very important element of the understanding of the Victorian society. Before there was this clash that is going to take place when sciences are going to be very important. So I'm going to now to slide number 17. It is still about this program of the revival. Now you understand the word that you can see on that slide. You can see, for example, the point number 5. The non-conformist churches were as prolific. So non-conformist, if you want to take notes, because that's not on my PowerPoint, are the Calvinist churches that did not conform to the Anglican Church. Okay, so there were some sort of secondary churches, but they were allowed. They were allowed, just like the Catholics were allowed, except that the non-conformists and the Catholics were not allowed to have important position in English society. Point number 6 is about the Methodists. Methodists is a Calvinist church that you find everywhere in the world. If you know of the famous South African icon Nelson Mandela, he was a Methodist. He was educated by missionaries who came to South Africa and started school. And he was very happy with that, because he said that at the time it was apartheid, you know, you heard about apartheid. and he was able to be educated by the Methodists because the apartheid government did not want black people to be educated. So there is a positive aspect to the evangelical process. Of course, not everything is positive, but this is positive. So in order to do the revival, you see the Methodists were, for example, increased the number of their chapels from 825 to 11,000. That's enormous. They created 11,000 chapels or churches everywhere in England. The Baptists, remember, of course, the American Baptist Martin Luther King's, but the Baptists in England, from 652 churches, they created 2,800. And they built them, of course, where the new parishioners were. Parishioners, you know, it's a denomination that comes from the parish. It means where there is a church and the community around. They went where the people were. That is where the peasants had left the countryside to go to become industrialized worker. One of the reasons, as if you look at the beginning of this slide, there were because there was a massive arrival of people around one church. Of course, you understand that there were not enough room for everybody in each church. 12 churches, for example, had from 25 to 35,000 people. You can take the biggest church you want, you cannot put 35,000 people. So it means that where those people were, the land was divided into parish. Churches were built so that, let's say, 200, 300, 400 people could go to one church. So it was, you see, subdivision, like an administrative structure, but linked to religion, which was not necessarily the same as the administrative structure of the land. The record, as you can see, was from a church in Bradford. For one church, there were 78,000 people. So you see, you must imagine how many churches they must have been built in order to welcome all these people. So this was an important revival process in Britain, which led, of course, to the missionary project that participated in the imperial effort. We will see that in chapter 6 when we come to it. Missionaries in the empire. Slide number 18, something maybe you heard about. The Salvation Army, in French, l'Armée du Salut, was created then because there were so many poor and destitute people living in slums. There were a lot of disease, no education, no sanitary conditions. You have to know that, for example, the sewage, les égouts, the sewage were invented in London in the 19th century because until then cholera was a disease that killed a lot of people. The founder of this Salvation Army is called William Booth, and you can see the motto of the Salvation Army, the 3 S's: soup, soap, salvation. And of course, this will have a great incidence. If you go to London and you walk from St. Paul's, you take the Millennium Bridge to go to the Tate Gallery, Tate Modern Gallery, you will see the Salvation Army on your left. So it still exists. Right. So this is a recording. If you want to have a break, just stop. We are going now to our second part. Out of 3, I remind you, when religion clashed with sciences. So the background you must know, theories of evolution and the clash. So slide number 20, it's about what you have to know is the science boom of the 19th century and the emergence of sciences. Slide number 21, you see a portrait of some people, men of course, because at that time women did not have a lot to say about sciences, although there were women scientists, but not that many. One of the biggest picture is you recognize him is Sigmund Freud. You have studied him in Terminal, so you must know who he was. If you don't, of course, go and check because it's always interesting. He said at the end of in the 20th century, he said there were 3 great traumas in the history of humanity. These traumas were linked to the clash between science and religion. The first one at the top, you can see it's not a picture, it's a drawing, because at the time there were no photographies. It's Copernicus, and it's called the Copernican revolution. And remember, at the time, the Earth was considered to be the center of the universe. And Copernicus said, no, the Earth is one planet just like the other, and it's revolving around the sun and not the contrary. This was a great shock because in the Christian belief of the time, our planet was the center of the universe because it had been created by God, as in the Bible. In Genesis, you know, the beginning of the Bible called Genesis, which is the creation of the earth. And people thought that was it, and there was nothing to question about. But now, as a scientist, Copernicus started to say that it was not the case, that the Earth was just like another planet. So, of course, this was a great shock. This is why Freud said it was one of the great revolutions in human, and also not just a revolution, but also a trauma. The second one is very interesting for us because we're going to talk about it now, and it took place during the Victorian era in England. It's the Darwinian revolution. Charles Darwin, as you can see him as a young man there, not with his white beard as you're used to see him. So this is I've done it on purpose to put his picture as a young man. The idea is that there is an evolution. His revolution is to say that there is an evolution on our planet. Animals, plants, the earth even, the earth evolves, and of course humankind evolves. That is, our ancestors are not Adam and Eve like described in the Bible, which meant that everybody was the same and nobody moved. Of course, there would be questions like, but why are there people with different colors? Were Adam and Eve black people, Chinese people? That would be one of the questions that was raised during the 19th century. For Darwin, no, Adam and Eve did not exist. Men evolved from a group that gave, at the same time, humans and great apes. You remember, this is why the title of this chapter is about apes and angels. And so this was a great shock. It was so shocking that he had his theory 20 years before he published his book. Remember, it's the date of this chapter, 1859, the publication of The Origin of Species. He postponed the publication of his book for 20 years. Why? Because he was afraid of the reaction of people, and particularly the reaction of the different Christian churches. When he finally published, it was a better time for him because religion had less influence. And so the shock was less great and he was less attacked, although we will see there were heated debates about his theory. Of course, his theory is today commonly accepted in most countries in the world, except a few evangelical Christians, particularly in the United States, who still consider that the Bible is tells the truth and the earth was created in seven days by God. But I should say that these people are a minority. Finally, Freud put the emphasis on his own revolution, which is the psychoanalytical revolution. You know, he invented psychoanalysis, at least he conceptualized it because it existed before. And his idea is that our life is subordinated to our unconscious. If you do not believe in psychoanalysis, you may say we do not have an unconscious, and I cannot prove it to you. First, because nobody can prove it except by experience, and also because that's not my job. That's not my point. But I do believe that we have an unconscious. My experience showed it to me. And for Freud, he took the example of the iceberg. This is why you have a little drawing next to Freud and the text. You have an iceberg saying that the emerged part of the iceberg is what is conscious to us, what we conceptualize, what we understand, what is conscious in our mind. But the biggest part of what we have in mind is unconscious. And you know about all his theory, the Oedipus complex and all that. Interestingly, two of the major traumas that, or revolution that Freud expressed took place in the 19th century. His own was end of 19th century, beginning of 20th century. By the way, just to remind you that Freud went to live in London in 1895. So we are still in the Victorian era. So the emergence of sciences in slide number 22. Why? Why was there the emergence of sciences? Sciences had always existed, of course. You know that from the beginning of humanity, men have started to wonder, to question, to try, and to test. Scientists have existed, the Greek, Romans, Assyrians, Mesopotamians, in South America, everywhere there were scientists. I have mentioned a few in the Middle Ages, in the Renaissance, etc., etc. But why was there that boom in the 19th century? Because, slide number 23, for two main reasons I would like you to remember. First, because the 18th century, so before our program, is called the Age of Enlightenment, le siècle des Lumières in French. The century of enlightenment that promoted a key concept, and please remember that key concept, which is reason. Reason, thinking. You go to school to develop reason, okay? By opposition to emotions. Someone who is not educated will react emotionally. We are, of course, we can work on both aspects, reason and emotions. But for example, you know that propaganda, whenever there is a government, if we take the Nazi government, for example, during the Second World War, they would use propaganda on the emotional aspect and not the reason. This is why a lot of tyrants, dictators, do not want people to be educated, because then they can reason. If they can reason, they can contest the validity of the political program of the dictator. So reason is a part of freedom, part of democracy. It's important to have a good democracy. We can see if you want to resist populism, like in some big countries on the American continent, whether in the north or in the south, where populism is present and reason is not accepted. We know that because there are climate skeptical people. They do not accept sciences, which is madness from my point of view, and stupid. But it's because they appeal to emotions to people. They do not appeal to their reason. So reason is an important process of humanity, and this is an aspect which was promoted in the 18th century with all the philosophers that you know. Hume in England, former philosophers such as Hobbes and Locke, or in France, of course, Rousseau, etc., etc. So this century of enlightenment developed the idea that maybe we should not believe in anything, but we should find the proof. And this is how, of course, sciences developed. The other aspect, of course, is a more pragmatic one. As you can see, the second one is the Industrial Revolution that required scientific such knowledge One of the first sciences to be really that emerged from that period is geology. Once again, as I said before, in order to find coal. You need coal for the companies, for the ships, for the steamships that were invented in the 19th century. You need coal for the plants, for the factories, and therefore, in order to have an industrial revolution, you must have coal. In order to find coal, you must have specialized people who can find it for you, because it's not you cannot find coal anywhere. You need to know the history of our planet. This leads me to my slide number 24, which is about one of the key figures in these new sciences, or two of them. The first one, the most important one, is Charles Lyell. His book, Principles of Geology, is still studied today at the Fac de Sciences in biology. So just to let you know that he did a good job, because his book is not outdated. We will see, well, I don't know if but an anecdote is that when Charles Darwin went for his trip for 5 years on board the ship, the Beagles, he went to study plants, animals, everything in the world, and it's when he came back that he had the concept of evolution in his mind. Well, in order to start his journey, and sometimes not to be bored, because it's sometimes a long trip, it took 5 years for him to go around our planet. He had the Principles of Geology by Charles Lyell. It was such a good book that he ordered volume number 2 years after the departure. So you see, this book was a key element also to help Darwin to produce his theory on evolution. Robert Chambers is also famous for having spread the new science to more people, because of course books like written by Charles Lyell were only for specialists. They were scientific books. Commoners, it was difficult for them to read books. Robert Chambers turned the book into something accessible for other people. So geology is one example, but you have many other examples of new developments and new scientific development. Slide number 25, point 2b, the theories of evolution. The theories of evolution was not invented by Charles Darwin. You can see some people who worked on that, and particularly the one whose name is written in red, Jean-Baptiste Lamarck. As you can see, he was French. If you go to Paris and to the Jardin des Plantes, next to the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle, you will see his statue in the Jardin des Plantes. He was in fact one of the early people who started to work on this notion of evolution. He did not use the word evolution. The word evolution is really Darwin's invention. Jean-Baptiste Lamarck would talk about transmutation. Transmutation. You understand mutation, trans, to go from one thing to the other. Darwin preferred the word evolution, but Lamarck was the first to conceptualize this. And there were other scientists who also worked on that. If you look at the gentleman at the top, you see A.R. Wallace. It's because he wrote an article and he sent it to Darwin to ask for advice. He admired Darwin and he said, can you tell me what you think about my article? And Darwin was astonished and flabbergasted, because Wallace had reached the same conclusion that he had reached 20 years before, but remember, he had not published a book. So it is because of Mr. Wallace that Darwin hurried to publish his book in order to be really the first scientist to talk about the theory of evolution. So you see, it was a whole context. It was not just Darwin who invented the concept. He was also helped by other people. slide number 27, Charles Darwin. So just a reminder of what I've just said, and his books, The Origin of Species in 1859, and the other one, which is less famous but quite interesting, The Descent of Man, because he focused on the descent on man, particularly in that book. If you look at the text that you will have time to read after listening to this MP3, you will see that the book was a bestseller. The Origin of Species was a bestseller. 1,250 copies were sold immediately in 1 week. What does it mean? It means that it was not a novelty, once again. The notion of evolution was in the air. People had heard about it. People had heard that maybe the Bible was not, did not tell the truth, but was just an allegory, an image. And this is what it is known now to be for most Christian denominations. So people were interested, and therefore they bought the book. It had to be re-edited several times, and therefore this famous book was a bestseller from the beginning. Slide 28, to see the clash. The clash, of course, is that not everybody accepted this theory, and of course a lot of scientists debated. Now, interestingly, of course, we have to bear in mind that Britain was a very religious society at that time, even though atheism, l'atheisme, that is when you do not believe in an entity, was starting to progress in society. Some people now openly would say, I don't believe in God. Before that, it was difficult to say that, okay? You would not be punished or you would not go to prison, but maybe you would not have a good job if you said, I don't believe in God. So a lot of people didn't say it. Maybe they thought they didn't believe in God, but they pretended, okay? Of course, this is the positive aspect is that a lot of people stopped being hypocritical because they could say what they really thought. So the clash was an opportunity to oppose some views, and the best known debate, there were many debates, the best known debate took place in Oxford. This is on slide 29. It's called the Oxford Debate, that took place on June the 30th, 1860, between Thomas Huxley and Samuel Wilberforce. Thomas Huxley was a scientist. He worked with Charles Darwin. He was one of his disciples, one of his students, if you prefer. Samuel Wilberforce was a clergyman, also a scientist. What is interesting is that at that time, people could be many things. And Samuel Wilberforce, for example, we will see there were priests and bishops who were also scientists. And Samuel Wilberforce, his main job was not scientist. It was a bishop of Oxford. So from the Anglican Church, of course, when I say bishop and I don't mention anything else, it means from the Anglican Church. And you can see a drawing showing the debate, which was attended by a lot of people who were interested, and many journalists particularly, because they wanted to know how things were going to work. And of course, being a clergyman, Samuel Wilberforce put forward the Bible, while Huxley put forward what was being discovered at that time, fossils, which was for him a proof that there was an evolution, because those animals had existed and they had been petrified. So the debate was a heated one, as you can see on the picture, where people are raising their arms, probably shouting. And it was, ironically, Wilberforce asked a question to Huxley, which the journalist picked up, of course, because it was a juicy comment. Wilberforce wanted to know if Darwin had monkey ancestors from his grandfather's side or grandmother's side. So of course it was ironical but it explains why there are many cartoons of Darwin as a monkey. And you remember, this is what you have at the beginning of this PowerPoint. If you go back to the beginning of the PowerPoint, you will see a caricature of Darwin with the body of a monkey, but the head of Darwin with his white beard. And it comes from this ironical remark, which of course is stupid in terms of sciences, but what was meant to make people laugh. Apparently, it's difficult to know who won the debate, but it seems that Huxley was more serious and therefore brought more convincing element to the analysis. The debate continued amongst people, and this slide number 30 is for me an opportunity to tell you that you must not say it is a clash between religion and sciences. Why? Well, because if you look at the gentleman that you have here, if you take, for example, Georges Cuvier, he was a French scientist. He's very famous. He worked at the Muséum d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris, and he is very famous because he invented a new science called compared anatomy. Compared anatomy. In French, you understand, anatomie comparée. This also became known as with a new name called paleontology. Paleontology. And you know, if you're a paleontologist, you study the bones of dinosaurs, the fossils. So he was a real scientist, as you can see, but he was also a Christian. As a Frenchman, I think he was Catholic. And he rejected Darwin's ideas of evolution. Although he was a scientist, he supported the fixist theory or creationist theory, which is that God created the earth in 7 days. On the other hand, you have William Buckland, for example, just next to Darwin. He was a clergyman also from the Church of England, just like Edward Hitchcock. And they were pro-evolutionists. They were scientists also, and they were pro-evolutionists. Which means that, as you can see, you had clergymen who were pro-evolutionists and scientists who were anti-evolution. Another one, for example, who was a scientist who was anti-evolution, who was creationist, was Richard Owen. It's the third one on the top. You have Georges Cuvier, Gideon Mantel, and Richard Owen. Richard Owen, for example, invented the word dinosaur. He invented the word, the name. And he worked at the Museum of Natural Sciences in London, which still exists. You can still visit it. So you see, once again, another scientist, but who is creationist. So these people show you that you cannot say it's every religious people was against evolution and every scientist was against religion. No, it was not the case. Be more careful if you oversimplify things. This is a very important point. I'm going now to slide number 31. Just you can see Mr. Owen in the caricature at the bottom. You recognize his face with his long hair. And just to explain to you that geology led to paleontology. Paleontology became a new science, and you have to know that before the 19th century, people did not know why animals were fossilized. And some historians have said that it is maybe why there is the myth of the Gorgon in antiquity. You know, that creature which has snakes, that it's a woman, she has snakes instead of hair, and when she looks at someone in the eyes, they become petrified. It was this idea that creatures could be petrified by magic, because fossils could be found and there was no explanation. It's only in the 19th century with geology and paleontology, the study of dinosaurs and fossils, that it was people were able to give an answer to this mystery of the petrified animals. To finish this second 2C part, let's go on to slide 32. To once again to show you that there was a mix of being a scientist and being a clergyman. I took an example from South Africa because some of you may know, but I'm also a specialist of South Africa, which I like very much. So this example is a Victorian one, of course, but from South Africa. This Anglican missionary bishop, John William Colenso, started to criticize the Bible because of what was going on in the 19th century. He was not the only one. Things started in Germany. Things started with Protestant theologians in Germany, in France, and in England. And in other countries, of course, the Netherlands, Belgium, etc. They started to criticize the Bible, and he did it on a scientific basis. Why? Because he was also a professor of mathematics. So you see, once again, at that time, you could have two jobs at the same time, or at least have studied twice. He was a mathematician. He was a friend of Charles Lyell's, the one who wrote the book Principles in Geology. He would meet him and talk a lot with Lyell's before he was sent as a missionary to South Africa. And they talked science, but he was also a clergyman. He also had to teach the Bible. And the story he told in his memoirs is that one day he was translating the Bible into Zulu, a population in South Africa, the Zulu people, very famous people in South Africa. And he had the help of a translator, a young Zulu man who could speak English and, of course, speak Zulu. He could also speak Zulu, but it was better to have the help of a native speaker. And he said in his memoir that he remembers the day when the young Zulu asked him, Reverend, that's how you call a priest in the Anglican Church, Reverend, do you really believe in that story of the Bible when animals go inside an ark and then survive the flood, le déluge, and then when the ark comes back on the land, they go out and leave and start a new living? And Bishop Colenso said, I had to admit to him that I did not believe in the story. Of course, you can imagine a scientist, a mathematician, having a story of animals, I mean, a lion and giraffe in the same ark. He said, no, I had to admit he did not believe it. And so he started questioning the Bible just like other people were doing. And this is called biblical criticism. It was a big, he published a book on that, and it was a big problem with his church because, of course, it was not accepted. But he was helped by the fact that there were the theories of evolution at that time. And in the 20th century, most Christian churches acknowledged that he was right and that other people were right, that in fact most Christians, once again I'm not saying all Christians, I'm just saying most Christians, whether Catholics, Protestants or Orthodox, most of those churches accept the theories of evolution, and they say that the Bible is just a parable, that is a story to educate people, to tell, but in fact the planet was created by God for Christians, of course. It was the Big Bang. In fact, they say God created the Big Bang, and then there was evolution, and then God did not intervene in the creation of the earth. So, of course, it's a way to say that the Genesis in the Bible is not the true story, it's just a story. And this is how Christians, most Christians, can accept the theories of evolution today, as well as still believe in God, but not in what the Bible says. I said not all of them because I told you some Christian churches still consider the Bible as being the origin of humanity. All of this happened in the 19th century. So you see the clash between reason and religion and former beliefs. My last point, slide 33, is about sciences and social progress. Once again, the background you must know, and prejudices justified by pseudo-sciences. Pseudo-sciences means that they are not real sciences. They are fake sciences. Just to take up an expression that you know with fake news, you can talk about fake sciences. They pretend to be true, but they are not. They are not real sciences. They are not explained scientifically. Just like when a president of a big country says that the COVID-19 will go away by itself. This is not scientific. Okay? Right. So slide number 34, 3a, the background you might know, Victorian patriarchal society supported by social sciences. Now, remember, we said that there was a feudal system until the 19th century, the 18th and 19th century. Britain was really the first country to stop this system, and we will see that it had an important consequences on society. For example, with the emergence of the middle class, the bourgeoisie, you can use the French expression. This class emerged in the 18th century and in the 19th century, and it was put in the middle, because before that, the feudal system had only two classes: the upper class, the aristocracy, and the rest of the people, two classes. Now there is a middle class, a class which is put in between the upper and what is used to be called the lower class. Of course, this feudal system is a very patriarchal society. I'm not going to tell you something you didn't know, of course. You know that patriarchal societies are being questioned today. Equality between sexes is on the agenda of every French and world citizen, I would say, today. So this is not new, what I'm telling. But of course, in Victorian society, you have to remember that women did not have the same rights as today. For example, they did not have the right to vote. And this is going to be one of the key elements linked to sciences. So I'd like you to go on to slide 35, and you can see several elements here that illustrate what we have been talking about. These sciences that emerged in the 19th century were in the wake of the theories of evolution. This is why I mentioned to you caricatures of Darwin with the body of a monkey but the head of a man. Now, this is, of course, a misunderstanding of Darwin, a shortcut that was made by Wilberforce. Remember, Bishop Wilberforce in Oxford in 1860, when he questioned, of course, ironically, he didn't want the answer, but he wanted to lampoon, to make fun of Darwin. He asked whether it was from his grandfather or grandmother that Darwin came down from the monkey. Now, this is really a wrong interpretation of Darwin's theory and what you learn in biology, because our ancestors were not monkeys. Our ancestors were common to today's monkeys or apes and humans. Okay, so we have common ancestors, but they were not monkeys. They are called pre-humans by scientists, pre-humans, and then or proto-humans and humans. Okay, and in between you have a diverging branch, which is the great apes. Okay, so to say that our ancestors were monkeys is a false statement. If you look at some of the drawings here, you can see that a racial prejudice took advantage of this notion of evolution, because people could say, yes, of course we can see that the white man has evolved and into a civilized man. But if you see some of other populations, of course, well, some populations are compared to monkeys on a pseudo-scientific way. That is, the measurement of the skull, for example, and le crâne, would show the difference between someone from another continent and a European. Particularly the Greek profile, the Greek European profile, was seen as the best example of man's evolution. And the other races, other people from other parts of the world, were not at all in the same way. And therefore, they were not as evolved as the Europeans. You understand this is false, this is a false theory, but people would measure skulls and say, look, this is, I have the proof that there is a difference. The monkey is present because, of course, then it is a way to show that some people are less, have less evolved. The evolution took time. This is why you have a cartoon, am I a man and a brother? Okay, and very often you have studied this last week. Sorry, you have studied a cartoon with John Bull and Irish people, and Irish people were often compared to monkeys. And you do know that till today some people from different origins are still compared to monkeys. This is a stereotype. It's false. You cannot compare a person to a monkey. But some racist people or white supremacists think it is a good political argument to compare someone to an animal. It started really in the 19th century with theories of evolution, of course, which Darwin did not accept at all. Darwin rejected the use of Darwinism to justify racism. Another aspect. So the first aspect, this is I'm going to give you the three consequences of false sciences in the 19th century. So we saw with slide 35 the comparison between white Europeans and particularly Englishmen. We will see that later it will even be northern people, blonde hair, blue-eyed, you know, it rings a bell. It reminds you of the racist theories of the Nazis during the Second World War. Well, it started also in England with that. So the first, slide number 35, is a justification of the superiority, the so-called, okay? I don't agree with that, and nobody agrees. I mean, scientists do not agree. But racist people think that there is a superiority of white people over other people. That's slide number 35. If you go to slide number 36, you will see that Victorian patriarchal society also thought that white men was superior to white women. And of course, this is what is a patriarchal society. When the pater familias, that is the father, dominates the family, he is the sole decider. And of course it was true, because at that time a woman a Victorian woman, particularly a lady, because a working class woman could be free by working by herself. But an upper class woman would have to obey to her father until she got married. Then she has to obey her husband. And finally, if the husband dies before her, she has to obey her son. So an upper class woman was never free. And this is what the two cartoons that you have on slide number 36 exemplifies. That is, it shows you the evolution of monkey to women, as you can see, with the four different representations. And of course, this is very offensive. If ladies should be shocked, I hope, gentlemen, you will be shocked also. Anyway, you wouldn't be able to do that today, or else you would be considered as a very sexist person, and you might have problems with justice. And I think it would be a good thing, because there's no reason why to consider a woman as an inferior to a man. And the next illustration is interesting, because you have a polling station, and that is, people are going to vote, but the woman is rejected. She's not allowed to vote. You know that women will have the right to vote. You have studied the franchise in 1918. And on the other hand, you have a working class man who taunts the lady, which is not normal because he's not from the same class, but is saying to her, go away, only men can vote. So this slide number 36 shows the feeling of superiority of men over women. And of course, you have heard about the suffragettes who will fight in order to have the right to vote. The third element is in slide 37. The third element, which is a false idea that Englishmen are superior to other people. We remember the first, the Englishman is superior to people from other ethnic groups. Englishman is superior to English women. And in slide number 37, you have the idea that Englishman is superior, upper class Englishman is superior to working class men. So it's the class opposition. Are some men fitter than others to dominate? Class distinction. The word fitter is because of the theories of evolution. One interpretation, false interpretation of Darwinism is that some people are fit to survive. This, we will see in a second, was coined by a man who talked about the survival of the fittest, la survie des plus aptes. And this, of course, is true for nature. Only the animals that are the strongest survive. If not, they die of disease or they get eaten by other animals. Humans are different. This is what Darwin said. Humans are different. For example, humans for many millenniums have preserved the old people in the family. Whereas an old animal dies, he's not protected by his family. So that's the main difference for Darwin between animals and humans. So are some men fitter than the others? It was a justification that the upper class had to dominate the working class because they were fitter, they were more intelligent, they had the money, they knew how to run a society. Working class people were only there to serve them. So this is the third element, and a very important one to the understanding of the Victorian society. It will take time for these three patterns to disappear, and they haven't completely disappeared. Superiority over races, superiority over women, and superiority of class. These three elements still exist, unfortunately, today, even though things are better, particularly for women. Slide 38. We're getting close to the end of today's program. 3b, prejudices justified by pseudosciences. So we are still in the same topic as before, but we go into details. So please go to slide 39. Slide 39 is the emphasis is put on one person that used Darwin's theories in order to justify his own ideas. And the man's name is Herbert Spencer. He is the author of several books, and one particularly called "The Survival of," and he coined the sentence, "The survival of the fittest." Okay, you understand? Fittest, it's a superlative. To be fit, c'est être en forme. The fittest, c'est celui qui est le plus en forme. Okay, la survie des plus aptes. So if you are strong, intelligent, you have more chances to survive than if you are weak and stupid. Of course, this justified a lot of things, as I said. For example, the fact that women are considered weaker. It's true that as far as the muscle power is concerned, men have more. But it is known that women have more resistance, for example, than men to long-term ordeals. So this is why it's true to consider that man is superior to women, generally speaking. But according to Spencer, it was clear that men were superior to women, and therefore, as a consequence, women had to obey men. Same thing for people from other countries, particularly if they were not as strong as white men, which is false also, of course. Let's take, for example, the Africans. White colonialists in the 19th century thought they were stronger than black men. But we know that it's not true, and this is why the best proof that ever came was in the Berlin Olympic Games, when Hitler refused to give the medal to Jesse Owens, who was a black American sprinter, because he defeated all the white German sprinters during the Olympic Games in Berlin. And because it was a contradiction to the Nazi theory inherited from Spencer that white people were stronger than black people. And this is an example of a false science that is used for ideological purposes. And of course, you can apply the same to the different classes. White people, upper class white people said, we are intelligent, we are educated. The workers are not educated, they are not intelligent, therefore they cannot rule. And it's interesting because we heard that recently when there were demonstrations in France of people saying, but these people are not intelligent, they are not educated, they are poor people, and they cannot rule. So why do they protest, and why do they destroy things? And the proof that they are not intelligent people is that they destroy things, including the Arc of Triumph in Paris. So just to show you that these ideas from the 19th century still prevail today, in the sense of some people feel superior to others. Then we go on to slide 40, which is still about Herbert Spencer. So there are details you can read clearly. One important one is the last one, which is that Spencer was not it would be, now, the first thing I'd like to say is that you cannot say that 19th century Victorians were racist. Why? Because it's an anachronism. The word racist comes from the 20th century. It was invented in the 20th century. Now, today you can call someone a racist if he says something negative about someone because of the color of his skin. And he is a racist because he knows it is forbidden to do that, and it's not nice, and it's not correct. in the 19th century, people were not racist. They were, maybe you could say they were race-minded. That is, they had the mind of that there was a difference in race, but that's all. So Spencer was horrified. This is the last point of slide 40. Spencer was horrified when social Darwinism, of which he was really the main founder, was used to justify policies to which he was deeply opposed. So you see, when he saw that it was used, his theories, just like Darwin's, were used to justify something unjustifiable, such as the superiority of a man over another one, he was horrified. So it's just that, of course, the conclusion to this, to the two slides on Spencer and social Darwinism, is that you cannot control your ideas. Once they are out, you cannot control them. They can be manipulated. Once again, to take my favorite example, if you take a president of a big country overseas, he is going to use fake news just to justify his policy, his populist policy. Of course, he accuses people of having fake news, but in fact it is himself who is using fake news. Of course, I'm not giving you names, I'm not doing any politics, but it's a good example of how you can manipulate science and ideas. Of course, Darwin rejected also all this for the reasons I told you. That is, Darwin considered humans different from animals, and therefore the theories of evolution did not work with men, just because men can help poor people. The Salvation Army was created, remember? You keep your old parents at home. Now we put them into clinics, but we don't let them die in the street, okay? Which the animals do. So Darwin was really also horrified. And so when you see social Darwinism, please do not make the mistake to think it's Darwin who did social Darwinism. Not at all. Darwin did a good theory that is accepted by scientists, that there is an evolution, and we see that every generation is taller than the previous generation, and therefore there's a logic that there is an evolution, because younger generations are better fed and they eat better, they do sports. So it's always, this is one of the key issues of evolution. Another example that is on slide 41 of these false sciences. This is about someone which is close to Darwin because it's his own cousin. His name is Francis Galton, and interestingly, he was a doctor. So he was a scientist, he was a real doctor, he did practice medicine, but he also was part of the Darwin family. Their grandfathers were brothers. And so Galton's grandfather had a daughter who married Mr. Galton. This is why Francis Galton is not a Darwin. But the two brothers, were brothers and were Darwins. Erasmus Darwin was Darwin's grandfather. Anyway, Galton is Darwin's cousin, and he invented something which is still exists today, called eugenics. Eugenics is the manipulation of the genes in order to improve the race. Now, of course, eugenics still exists because we know that it can be positive if you work on a disease, a genetic disease, and you want to avoid a baby to have the same lethal genetic disease as parents, and therefore you try to take away the gene before the baby is born, and so you can save the baby. So that's a positive aspect of eugenics. But of course, the rest of the aspects, which are when they are used for manipulation and for purposes that are not nice, then eugenics becomes very negative. Eugenics, for example, before it was known as the name, in antiquity would be that if a baby was born handicapped, it could be seen by the person who gave birth to the baby. They would kill the baby so as not to take care of the deformed baby. This is eugenics. This is natural eugenics. That is, leaving a baby to be killed in the jungle, for example. Of course, eugenics can be dangerous because if people say they want to choose the sex of their child, and in patriarchal society, it's very negative, particularly when you know that when there was restriction of birth, whenever a girl was born, she was killed, so that parents could have another child and hope to have a boy, because they were allowed only one child. So in patriarchal societies, choosing the sex of the baby is a danger, because you might end up with a society of only boys and no girls. And of course, you all know that girls become women and women can have children, while boys become men and they cannot have children by themselves, at least. You know that. So eugenics questions a lot and is a very hot issue in societies, ethically particularly. Are we allowed to do that or not? Can a 70-year-old woman be fertilized and give birth to a child? That's an ethic question that is still present today in our society. Now, the definition of eugenics, as you can see next to the text with the red part, is that is to check the birth rate of the unfit. So you see, we find the expression to be fit or unfit, the survival of the fittest, instead of allowing them to come into being, though doomed in large numbers to perish prematurely. The second object is an improvement of the race. So the first thing is to destroy all the unfit people, the so-called unfit, of course, which is totally horrible, of course, killing disabled people. And you know that, unfortunately, it's what the Nazis did. Even before the Second World War, they had gas chambers for German handicapped children. They were taken from the clinics where they were taken care of mentally ill children or physically disabled children, and they were put in gas chambers and killed, of course, and then the parents would be told that they died of natural causes. The Nazis did that before the war, and they did that to German children, their own children. So you see where eugenics can lead when they want to control the birth rate of the unfit. The improvement of the race, of course, we do understand that. You want people who have no disease, who are perfectly sound, mens sana in corpore sano, you know the Latin expression, un esprit sain dans un corps sain. And so improving the race can be positive, but of course it means manipulating the genes and manipulating the people. And what does it mean to be improved and to be in a perfect condition? Sometimes, okay, physically you can improve the eyes of people. I was operated of the cataract, for example, and I see better now. So there is an improvement for me. I see better. But how far does it go? How far can we go? And the last point, as you see on the slide, eugenics on bringing no more individuals into the world that can be properly cared for, and those only of the best stock. That's the problem of surpopulation, the idea that there are already too many humans on our planet for the the food that is present, the capacity to eat, and therefore the idea would be to destroy people who, particularly those who are not fit, so that you keep only the fit people in order to populate the earth. This is about eugenics. Some aspects might be interesting to improve the living condition of people, but of course it might be dangerous in the hands of a dictator who would want to to change the world to his own image. Slide 42, another of those pseudosciences that are not recognized. This one is not recognized anymore. It's called phrenology. I'll let you read a few things. That's just an example, so I don't need to go on too much. But it's the idea to study the skull of a person in order to predict something. For example, Galton, with his eugenics, measured the skull of people, and particularly the skull of convicts in prison, in order to try to find a pattern, saying that the skull is a justification that the man became a criminal. And so then he wanted to see in children if they had the same skull as a criminal, so that he said, this child is going to become a criminal. This is totally stupid. We know that criminality has nothing to do with the shape of the skull, but this is what people believed. This is a false science, once again. And slide 43, which will be a transition not for next week, but the following week's lecture. It's called Greater Britain versus Little England. And it's got to do with the colonies, in fact. Greater Britain would be is an expression that includes the British Isles and the British Empire. This is why it's Greater Britain. By opposition to Little England, which you see is not even the British Isles, it's not even Britain. Britain, remember, is England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. Little England is just Little England. So it means that you have a difference between people who want to dominate the world and others who want not to dominate the world, an opposition in terms of colonization. So the first point is that the British race was thoroughly analyzed by scientists, as we saw, and people said, oh, the British race is declining. Why was it said like that? Because 2/3 of recruits applying to enlist in the British Army for the Anglo-Boer War that took place in South Africa, as you see the dates at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, were rejected as unfit. That is, the idea was that because those people were workers who worked in factories, they were not healthy farmers that plow the land and therefore are strong, breathe nice air, have the sun to bring them vitamin. The farmer is seen as more physically apt than the worker in a factory. And when workers of factories who were unemployed wanted to go to the army, 2/3 were rejected as unfit. Once again, unfit, survival of the fittest, you see the point. So a lot of people started saying at the end of the 19th century, there is a danger. The English race is degenerating. The idea of degeneracy. So British ideologists turned to the empire to seek for solutions. Because, of course, well, still today, you know that the idea is that people from Australia, for example, are very strong people because they are descendant of the first colonizer, farmers. They are big and strong. It's the same in South Africa. It's the same in Canada. It's the same in New Zealand. So the idea was to develop Greater Britain. And one of the promoters was one of the men you can see was Charles Dilke, who promoted the idea of Greater Britain in 1868. He also promoted the idea of Greater Saxondom, but I'm not going to talk too much about that. The other promoter of Darwinian theories of the fittest is Joseph Chamberlain, former Secretary of State for the Colonies in 1903. For example, I just read, but you can read it, of course. The struggle for life, the struggle for existence in future will not be between cities or even between kingdoms. It will be between mighty empires, and the minor states will come off badly if they are left to be crushed between the gigantic bulk of these organizations. So you see, this quotation illustrates the idea that politicians took those ideas of evolution. The struggle for life is really an expression by Darwin. He expresses the idea that there is a struggle for life, and one of the key issues in his time is, why did the dinosaurs disappear? You know, the explanation came later, but we're not sure yet. However, dinosaurs did disappear. So there was a struggle for life, and the dinosaurs lost that struggle. Whereas men who were not fit to survive normally because they didn't have jaws, they didn't have tusks, they didn't have anything to defend themselves. They had their intelligence and they were able to survive. So the struggle for life is really an expression by Darwin, but of course the idea of the survival of the fittest that some politicians used came from the other interpretation of Darwin, the social Darwinist theories. And of course, this is a point we will develop not next week, but the following week. The next week is about politics in Britain, but the following week we will talk about the British Empire. And so please remember the class I'm just finishing today, this lecture, because it is at the root of the understanding of Victorian society, and not only because fascism in the 20th century will use those theories in order to justify their horrible deeds, and particularly the German and the Nazis and the Shoah. And so this is one of the key elements I'd like you to bear in mind. And so I'm just finishing with slide 44, and I still have 4 minutes to finish in order to not to go over the 2 hours of your class. So as the century came to an end, the Church of England appeared to faithfuls and faithless alike as the guardian of a set of beliefs which science and scholarship had long ago undermined. It had gained strength through the revival process, but had to accept cohabitation with people who considered that science and religious were compatible, and it developed biblical criticism. So you see, from our today's lecture on apes and angels, angels and apes, we see that things became modernized. That is, the Christian faith is still exists. Queen Elizabeth is still the supreme head, the supreme governor of the Church of England. There are still people believing in God, even though there are less and less, of course, but still it exists, and there is a cohabitation with sciences, of course, which emerged as true sciences, such as the theories of evolution. And what you must bear in mind is that it was really, as Freud said, a revolution, a trauma. What Darwin did in 1859 by publishing his book was really a revolution, not just for England, but for the rest of the world, because, of course, the theories of evolution are taught in everywhere on our planet, and it is commonly accepted that it is true, and of course scientific proofs are there, unless someone considers that science is lying, just like some leaders today, and might, for, of course, populist and political reason, deny the validity of sciences. But this is another story. This is not our program. But I think by putting things into perspective, you now understand how these notions of religion and science have really changed Victorian society, Victorian mentality, and things were able to evolve. Just one example to conclude. In 1882, a divorced woman was allowed to keep her money and her children. in a divorce case. Before 1882, women were not allowed to keep their children or keep their money if they got a divorce. This is one of the positive improvements of Victorian society. That's all, folks. That's all for today. I hope I was clear enough. Of course, you may write to me whenever, if you have any questions. You may ask questions during your tutorials, of course, also. And please do not leave a question unanswered. You never know, you might need the answer of, on the day of the exam. Thank you very much, and work well, and see you soon. Bye-bye.